All right, so let's say this is my finished poster, but now I want to make it optimized for 4-color offset printing, which will look like these dots. I really want to be able to send the files to the print house with all of these dot screens already created. And I would do this either to play with it as an effect or just to really control the printing process. Right now, this is an RGB file, an 8-bit RGB file. It uses what the computer calls millions of colors. And you'll notice I can zoom in and I'll see my 350 dots per inch, or my 350 pixels per inch, little squares, but you won't see any dots mixing the colors. You know, there's lots and lots of subtlety. Some are softly blended together, some are very sharp, especially ones that come from vectors. And the overall effect is very smooth. But that is not how it prints, because we don't have any printers that exist that have millions of inks with each color. So what do I need to do to optimize it? Well, the first thing I need to do is change it from RGB mode under image mode to CMYK color. That is cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And do I want to merge layers? I actually, for this example, I do want to merge them because I have finalized my poster. So then I say, okay. Now it's one flattened image. Let's see if the colors change notably at all. So the brightness around my image dulls a little bit in CMYK. Just a little bit, and that's truer to how it would actually print. You guys see that? Also, my layer styles that were one color dependent, like the glow, it changed from being a little bit darker when it was an RGB file, because it could use one color pixel throughout. So there you see it, a little bit darker, a little bit deeper, to being a little bit more muted, having to mix those colors out of CMYK channels. So it's the transition from using the light primaries of RGB to using the pigment primaries of cyan, magenta, and yellow. Okay, now I can actually see each color, each ink color layer. But they aren't layers, because layers are something we create. These are the color channels. So right next to layers, you'll see channels. You click on that, and you turn off CMYK, and you can selectively turn off the channels. So at the very bottom, I have black. There's not a lot of black in my design. In fact, it doesn't seem like there's any solid black. But this is the computer's language of saying where the black needs to be to layer into the inks in order to create my image. On top of that, we have yellow. So these are all the yellows. Notice how strong the yellow is in the title, right? Where yellow is the dominant color. On top of that, we have magenta, and magenta with yellow and black. It starts to give us a pretty dark culmination here. But without any of the cyan, everything looks really, really warm. And now if we add the cyan, we're at full color. Now what's cool about channels is I can isolate each one. So I can just do cyan and black, or I can do just cyan, magenta, and black, or I can just do magenta and black, right? But as soon as I isolate it to just one layer, it will convert that, or at least it will show it in grayscale. So this is the magenta channel, but it's showing to me in grayscale because this is how the film work is understood by the computer. If it's black, you have magenta there. If it's white, you have no ink there. And if it's gray, you have some percentage of magenta there. So you can see where it's black, that's solid magenta. And that's what it looks like when it's actually filled with ink. Now, how do I make this separated into a dot screen? Because the printing press cannot print gray. You know, it can only separate grays into dots. So then once I have the layer I want, so let's just do the magenta layer. Then I go to Image, mode, grayscale, and I'll flatten the layers. Notice I'm not saving it at any time here. And now I have just the magenta layer, right, in grayscale. And then I go to image mode, bitmap. And you have to go through grayscale to get to bitmap. Now, bitmap means that it only sees black or it only sees white. It can't see gray at all. So in order to convert a grayscale image to a bitmap image, you have to separate out the dots. So it's asking me, how many dots do I want? Well, I want an output resolution that matches for this. So let's do 350. And what method do I want for creating dots? Our inkjet printers do the same thing, but they use what's called a sand pattern, a diffuse sand pattern, which looks kind of random. But to make it kind of a mechanical process, to look like an old a Pokemon card or something printed professionally, we're going to use what's called a halftone screen, not a diffusion pattern. So I'll use halftone screen at 350. Then it's going to ask me the frequency. Now that's how many dots it will use, how many lines of dots it will have per inch. The lower I make the number, the bigger the dots will be. So I want it to be pretty low. Now, the other question is, what angle should these dots be? Now, for that, I need to remember what color channel this is. This is the magenta channel. So I don't want it at 45 degrees. That's for black. What do I want magenta at? Has to be 30 degrees off of black, minimum. So that is 75 degrees. And then I can pick the shape. And I like to use, in the new versions of Photoshop, you have the option of using rounds, which are kind of the classic. So I'm going to use rounds. So then I say OK. And sure enough, look what it did. It converted my beautiful, fully grayscale image into a bitmap image that is only black and white, separated with round dots that are pretty big. And yet it's still at 350 pixels per inch, so those dots are fairly well defined. But it is limiting to do this because I'm creating round dots with square pixels. So in order to get perfectly round, well, it's impossible to get perfectly round dots, but it would take a ton of resolution to get kind of cleanly formed dots. Okay, now I would take that color, but actually I would just send that. I would save this as my magenta film work. I would save it to the desktop. I would save it as whatever, probably a TIFF, and send it as a flattened TIFF file, archive file with LZW to the printer. And I would call it magenta so that then the printer would open this file up and they would know to print this screen with magenta ink. And that's how it works. But what if I want to mimic that in Photoshop? Well, then I would have to replace all these black inks with magenta. So how do I do that? Well, there's a few ways, but because bitmaps are just black and white images, all I have to do is select the blacks and then erase everything else and then fill the black with magenta. But a bitmap is an extremely efficient file type that has almost no options to it. So in order to get those options, I have to convert it back to grayscale, and I want a size ratio to be 1:1. So now it has the ability to fill it with color, or at least with grayscales. Then I have to convert it back to an RGB color, and then I can select all the black. And only then can I fill it with the paint bucket with magenta. I got to do it everywhere, not just contiguous. All right, so now that's actually what that film work would print as. Then I have to do it for the cyan layer, for the yellow layer, for the black layer, and then I have to layer all of those up together. That's how you make something print ready. That's a lot of work. And that's why you get paid, big bucks to be a graphics professional graphic artist. You can even major in just these skills in a degree called graphic communications. But wouldn't it be nice if someone did all that work for you? And I have done that for you. Most professionals write their own code for this. Mine just happens to be kind of old. So I'm going to go back to my Photoshop file. And I'm going to flatten it just to play with this, save it as a test file, and then separate out the dots. And you'll see how it works. All right. So the reason I'm going to flatten it is just because there's a whole lot of layers, a whole lot of extra processing. So I'm just going to go to Layer, Flatten Image, discard all the hidden layers, and then save this as something else. So I'll save this as a test file onto the desktop. Okay, now with this flattened image, because I don't want to overwrite my multi-layered one, I am going to go to Actions, Window Actions, and I'm going to find Carl Color Separations action. You can load all of these actions from Dropbox. You can see the demo a couple demos ago where you go to Dropbox, you download the folder, you open up the zip file in your downloads, you add them into your actions window like this, saying load actions, and then you just use one and save it, and all of them will stay in there in Photoshop until you delete them. So I'm going to use the color separations action and the one at the bottom because I don't want to just do magenta. Well, let me show you. The magenta one alone will do exactly what I showed you. It will just separate out the magenta layer into dots. And these are just elliptical dots instead of round, which actually works a little bit better with square pixels. Okay, and it will create it as a new layer, which is very helpful. So it did all of that immediately. Now, if you do my CMYK full run action, it will do all 4 color files separately, and then it will do one combined file. And as long as you flattened your image first, it shouldn't take forever to do it because you're making it fairly easy. So I have my black layer here. Again, there's not much black in this design. My yellow layer, my cyan layer, my magenta layer, and then the one that combines them all with just white underneath. And it has cyan, magenta, yellow, and then black. And it's somewhat offset. So you'll see that the cyan is slightly offset from the magenta, yellow is slightly offset. It's the angle of the dots, the different angles, that allow that offset to happen. Now, does this look as good as the millions of color? No, not at all. But what I do is I then take these and I'll put them on top of my millions of color image. So let me close all these others. And I'm just able to play with them that way, just as a design tool. So I take all of these, which is how it would be printed in like a cheap newspaper. Come on, give me the, there we go. I take all these layers, all except the white background, and I just drag and drop them onto my full color. And my action outputs at 300 dots per inch instead of 350, which is why it's going to be a little smaller. But as they're all selected, I can just hit Command-T, hold down Shift, bring it up to the native resolution. And that's just another opportunity for it to offset a little bit. And now this is kind of fun. So I've got something that looks very much like the Pokemon card within my digital file to play with. Let me show you those dots. Right. It's just a little bigger and clunkier. And I can decide where I want them to be used. So for instance, I can say I don't want the magenta at all, or I can really downplay the yellow, or I can move the black to the very bottom, or I can set them on different blending modes. This is often what I'll do, just to experiment with them.